A really warm welcome to everybody turning up for this, the first ever Café Théologique online. We didn't choose to do this, but here we are, and I'm looking at my screen. There's at least 44 of us meeting here, which is a great turnout, so thank you so much for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Mark Lanesmith. I'm an Anglican chaplain at the University of Reading. I'm currently actually sat on campus in a hideous white room, but allegedly it means that I have really good internet access, which is better than at home. Café Théologique, if you've not been involved before, meets twice a term. We invite some theologians to come out of their ivory towers and to justify their overpaid existence by sitting them on a bar stool. We normally give them a pizza beforehand and then a pint of beer just to loosen them up. Obviously under the current sitting we're having to change things somewhat, but we hope to carry on this session and the next one, which I'll mention a bit later on, in pretty much the same way. We'll be recording this and this will be available afterwards on our Facebook site and also via YouTube, we hope. So without further ado, let me give you an introduction to what we're doing tonight. I originally booked just one speaker, Jayme Reaves, who I'll introduce in a moment. But when Jayme and I were preparing this session, Jayme said, hey, why don't you get David, my co-worker on the project, who's in New Zealand? Now, normally our budget wouldn't have stretched to flying somebody over. But since we're all relaxed and using Zoom, it turns out that David can in fact join us from New Zealand. Although I think it's quite early in the morning for him at the moment, I think 6:30. So we're really delighted to have two speakers. So allow me to introduce them. Firstly, Dr. Jayme Reaves. Jayme, who you can see on the screen, I hope, who I will pinpoint in a moment. Jayme is from the deep south of the United States. She has worked as a consultant, a facilitator, and a lecturer in the US, the UK, the former Yugoslavia, and Northern Ireland. She completed her PhD in theology at Trinity College, Dublin, and she now works at Sarum College in this country as the coordinator for the Centre for Encountering the Bible, which sounds like a great job title, Jayme.
It's great.
and her colleague, who she's been working with on the project, and I suspect probably your former PhD supervisor, David?
He was indeed.
Professor David Tombs. David is a lay Anglican theologian, previously a lecturer in theology at Roehampton University, and then between 2001 and 2014 he worked in Belfast as the Assistant Professor of Conflict and Resolution for the Irish School of Ecumenics at Trinity College, Dublin. And now he works as the Howard Peterson Chair of Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago in New Zealand. So a very warm welcome both to Jayme and to David for this evening. Our topic tonight is going to be looking at the question of sexual abuse within the story of the crucifixion, a very much of an overlooked topic. And this is a project that Jayme and David and others have been working on to help the church engage better with the question of sexual violence by engaging with those texts in scripture which itself touch upon them, but we might not be aware of. The format for our tonight is I'm going to hand over to Jayme and David, who'll talk through their project, and then we're going to turn into more of a workshop style. In about 20 minutes, half an hour, we'll be breaking you into groups and getting you to look at a text together. We'll come back together about 8:30 and we'll have a plenary session of some questions and comments, and then we'll wrap up by 9 o'clock. Just a word of etiquette. Can I invite you just to remain on mute for this time? There will be chance to have comment and question later, but it does help if we don't have clashing voices. And that would be really appreciated if you could keep your videos off for the moment and then pop them on in groups. So without further ado, and with a very warm welcome, I'll hand over to Jayme.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen here if that's okay. Is it okay if I stop yours, Mark? Okay. Windows, there we go. Okay. Well, so for tonight, I wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview, kind of where we're going to go with this, and then yeah. So I'll just do the first kind of 5 minutes or so, then I'll hand over to David. So the first 5 minutes is sort of talking to you a bit about the project, kind of how things came together, what's informed that. And then David will do a bit around kind of images and imagination in the sense of where what led to this work, but also some ways in which we can be thinking about how we see it or don't see it, in the case may be. And then we'll spend some time in the Bible study. So we'll look specifically at Mark 15. So we'll give you the text on either Bible Gateway, or if you have your Bibles handy, then that would be really useful as well. And then we'll do a short break and talk a little bit more about why things matter. But as far as the project goes, a little bit first about the project. So the team, as Mark said, myself and David involved in the project, but also we have another colleague, Rocio Figueroa. She's based in New Zealand as well. And so the three of us are working on this project. And the research team, Rocio is originally from Peru, but now lives in Auckland and works at the Good Shepherd College in Auckland. And she takes a lead on the interview work that we do, and working primarily with victims of sexual violence. I myself am originally from the States, as Mark said, but also living and working here in the UK, but doing both UK and US based work on this project, primarily with workshops with local groups such as yourselves. So not necessarily with groups of survivors, but just general public work. But also I work around the publication stuff that we're doing. So we're working on a book, co-edited volume that should be coming out next year. But there's been a couple articles that we've been able to do this past year as well. And then David will tell you more about the work that he does. We've got some international partners that we work with, the Ujamaa Center, University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, University of Stellenbosch in South Africa as well. But also the Shiloh Project are our research partners with us too, or involved in the work that we do, which is a collaborative project between University of Sheffield, University of Leeds, and University of Auckland. So this work has been a really kind of long-standing interest, really, of David's. I feel a little weird, kind of like presenting David's work for David, but we've been doing this, both of us anyway. But it comes back, he started doing this work in the 1990s, and it's built on and uses a liberation theology approach, and arose from reading reports of torture and of political prisoner abuse in Latin America during the various conflicts that were happening there, such as in Guatemala and El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile, Argentina, in the 1980s primarily. And then using those experiences, keeping those experiences in mind, and then going back and reading the crucifixion text, going, what do we notice here? And so the article that first set this out was the article that David wrote in 1999 called Crucifixion, State Terror, and Sexual Abuse. And so that was the Union Seminary Quarterly Review. And I can put in the chat box when I finish the link to that, so you can read it yourself if you like. But it's also, the link is there. But also in 2017, Rocio and David started planning a research project that considered this article and how it might be updated and respond to the clergy sexual abuse scandals that were taking place in different countries, and also how David's research what it might say to survivors of sexual violence, including sexual violence during conflict, but not only that. Then in October 2017, we all probably remember the Me Too movement hit or erupted. And so David and I started working on this as an opportunity to reconsider his earlier article in relation to the issues that arose in relation to Me Too. And so we chose the project title, When Did We See You Naked? That links in different strands of the project together, but is based on the Matthew 25 text where Jesus questioned, I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me, naked, you didn't give me clothing. And then people answer, of course, when did we see you naked? And we were also inspired. There was a church in New York City that put up a sign that kind of combines the Me Too movement with this text, saying Jesus said, as you've done it to them, you've also done it to #MeToo. And so as a result, we thought, actually, there's some connections that we can make here, a zeitgeist, as it were, where people are talking about sexual abuse and harassment, and how that's a part of how things are hidden in plain sight, as it were. And so we started asking the question, well, what in the text is hidden in plain sight that we don't notice? And so as a result, we've been working on this and doing this work. And so I'm going to hand over to David now to do a little bit of the work around the images and the imagination that starts to kind of bring this to the forefront. And then we'll move over to the textual work, and we can pay some closer attention to that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, David, and you go ahead.
Thanks, Jayme, and great to be with everyone this evening. Let me pull up my screen share, bear with me. Oh, sorry, it's gone backwards. So I thought I'd start by just looking at a few images and commenting on how I think they shape our imagination in such a way that something that's there in the text we don't see. I'm really looking forward to the text work that we'll be doing shortly. So this is just preparing some of the thinking that goes behind the Bible study we'll be offering. This particular image comes from a piece that I wrote with Katie Edwards at the University of Sheffield. It was The Conversation, a platform that brings together academic work and journalism in an open access format. If you're interested in it, the link's there, and Jayme might be able to share that in the chat as well. Mm-hmm. I quite liked the image that they produced. We can go on and see it in a little bit more detail in the next photo here. What I liked about it is it brought some of the emotional intensity to the stripping to the fore. The faces of the two characters on either side of Jesus, if we can speculate about the emotion behind a stone figure or statue, looks to me like there's something significant going on. So although it's a fairly familiar image in the way they've depicted the scene, in this image of the stripping, they've brought some emotional intensity to it, which I think is important. In that conversation piece, you'll also see a link to a short clip from the HBO BBC series Rome, where there's the stripping of Vercingetorix, a Gallic chief. We're not going to show that now, but that's another example of how the images we see might shape our imagination. It shows quite a challenging stripping of a Gallic chief. In response to the article that Katie and I did, the Times and some other newspapers picked it up and generated a wider discussion on it. This particular picture, let me just give you a chance to look at that and see what you think of it. To me, this rather downplays both the emotional intensity of the stripping, but also the sense of threat which is involved with it. It's quite a genteel stripping. It's almost an undressing rather than a very threatening act of violence or abuse. And then this is the other image of the stripping, the third one. This is one we've used in some of the reports we've done. And I think this brings some of the action and intensity to the stripping. It's a 10th Station of the Cross from a Church of the Holy Cross in Sisak in Croatia. I think particularly here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'm just pointing to this figure to the right of Jesus as we look at it. They've also almost generated some of the emotion in what's going on in that figure, or two figures, it's not completely clear. But also look at Jesus's right hand, or the left hand as we're looking at it. It's almost as if he's doing what he can to preserve his modesty and dignity in a very undignified, humiliating context. And I think that also brings out an aspect of the stripping that is largely written out of the way we imagine this scene and this story, that there's something not just violent, but deeply humiliating and abusive that's going on when an adult male is stripped by other men as part of a punishment exercise. This is another image that we've used. That this one is an image of crucifixion, or it's a crucifix image. It's believed to have been done by Michelangelo. It's in the Santo Spiritu church in Florence. We're very appreciative of Alexandra Corrie allowing us to use the photo. And this one we use because it introduces us to the notion that Jesus was naked on the cross. So the stripping wasn't some irrelevant detail. It was part of the wider process whereby Jesus would be exposed naked on the cross. Now, many people are aware of that and they know that Jesus was naked, but often people say to us, but we've never heard that nakedness described as sexual abuse before. So this image is quite a good one for thinking through, well, what does it mean that Jesus was exposed naked on the cross, and what's the appropriate language that we should use for that? So on that, just some images and imagination around what's going on with the stripping, what's going on with the nakedness of the cross. I'll hand back to you, Jayme.
Okay. So just a second, let me share my screen again so we can spend some time in the text. Right, there it goes. Okay, so, oh, I need to make that there we go. Okay. So what I propose that we do is we start with a text, and what we normally do for these kinds of workshops is we do what's called a slow reading. And so we're going to read through it twice, and I'll pull the text up on the screen. I'll read it the first time and go quite slowly. We'll pause for a few seconds, and then we'll get Mark to read it for the second time. After that, I'll introduce a few questions verbally, but then I'll also put the questions on the chat, and we'll break up into small groups, and we'll be able to go from there. So let's see, sharing, it says is paused because I need to bring my window up front. Can you guys see it? Can you see what I'm sharing?
We can see your whole screen rather than just the presentation.
Oh, good. All right. Okay. So you shouldn't see that. You should only see. Hang on. Why is this not working? Resume share. Hang on. Let me just start that from scratch again. Apologies all. Is that better?
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Okay. There we go. So close reading, slow reading, then questions I'll introduce, then we'll break up into small groups, and I'll put the questions in the chat box as well so you have them. Okay. And in the small groups, you can just speak through the questions, and I'll tell you where we go from there. So this is Mark 15, 16 through 24. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace. Sorry. There we go. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters. And they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, and he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. Mark, you want to read it a second time?
Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters. And they called together the whole cohort, and they clothed him in a purple cloak. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck his head with a reed and spat upon him and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take.
Okay. So for the Bible study discussion, there's a few questions which I'll read through, and then again, I'll put them in the chat, and then we can break up into groups for you to discuss these questions amongst yourselves. And we've got until about 8:20 to do that, and then we'll come back in kind of 10 minutes before we take a quick break. So you just listened to the slow reading of Mark 15. So the questions we would like for you to consider. Who are the characters in the story, and what do we know about each of them? What forms of violence are used against Jesus? Is stripping a man a form of violence? And why do the soldiers strip Jesus? How many times is Jesus stripped, according to the text? You might want to reread the text carefully and identify how many times Jesus is stripped. Is the repeated stripping of Jesus a form of sexual abuse? And then lastly, Mark makes it clear that Jesus was stripped in front of a whole cohort. So is this reflected in the images that we looked at earlier? And how many do you know, or do you happen to think a whole cohort might be? Okay, so I'll copy those questions, put those in the chat. Mark, I assume you're doing the magic pressing of the button.
I'm doing all the magic pressing of the button. So you're going to receive an invitation coming up on your screen to join a breakout room. I put you in breakout rooms of 5 and a few of 3 or 4. So you'll be in your breakout rooms for a while. Can I invite you, when you're in your rooms, to unmute yourself and to put your video on? Feel free to go into your own rooms if you need to, or at the moment as well, feel free to disappear. But you should be getting an invite coming to you now.
What stood out to you in relation to the questions, words and actions in the passage that caught your attention, and then in relation specifically to the questions that we asked, So any observations first and foremost that you might not have noticed before? And you'll need to unmute your mics.
Can you put my video back on?
Yeah, if you want.
No, but it's been stopped by the host, apparently.
Oh, right. I need to do that then, because I'm still the host.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Most people's videos are on, so I'm not quite sure.
Mine's been disabled by the host as well.
So's mine.
Okay,
So's mine.
It might be
Are we allowed to them back on?
Hang on.
Does it really matter?
It doesn't really matter. Go ahead and ask your question, but Mark is now host, by the way.
Okay.
If you could introduce yourself and then ask your question, thanks. Or maybe give you a response.
Yeah, my name is Patricia and I'm from room 1.
Okay.
It says the host has asked you to start your video. Okay.
Just speak, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. One of the things that we noted, we didn't think it was sexual. We think it was more humiliation. We do understand that with abuse that there's got to be somebody who's powerful and somebody who's not powerful. But in this case, we do believe he was stripped to be humiliated rather than anything else.
Okay. Okay. Any other groups notice or disagree or have further thoughts about that? April, you've raised your hand.
Hi, we're in group 3, and a couple of things. We really noticed the calling together of the whole cohort, and that was something that several of us had never really taken account of, the fact that they had gone away and gathered these people. They'd called, and a cohort was apparently quite a large number of people. We're talking hundreds, which really shifted our perception of kind of just what this power game was about. We did, going back to the person from room 1, Patricia, wasn't it? There was a real sense that actually sexual abuse is about the power and the humiliation, and with the stripping, repeated stripping, and then dressing up in the purple clothes and the crown, and then stripping again, we did recognize a real sense of sexual violence and abuse, and a sort of a shame being the dehumanizing process when people are stripped and their clothes are torn. So yeah, that was some of the feedback from our group.
Okay. Anyone else have anything further to add? Susie, you raised your hand earlier too.
Yeah, we probably were along the similar lines to April. We did spend quite a lot of time thinking about what the cohort meant. And one of the things that struck us was how similar it was to the soldiers in Abu Ghraib and what they did to the prisoners there, and that whole dynamic, which actually puts it in quite a difficult place to process, doesn't it? And we'd agree, I think, that even if the main point was humiliation, like if you have got a power differential and nakedness, enforced nakedness, I don't see how, personally, I think that's always going to have sexual element. And like, you know, like we reflected a bit on possibly what wasn't being said in the text. Someone had previously talked with about this passage and said that raping of prisoners was pretty customary in that situation. I don't know if that's actually true, but like if it was kind of accepted that that would happen, then it probably wouldn't be written, and we could quite easily miss that.
Okay.
Hi, I haven't got a video. My name's Sarah, so I can't raise my hand.
That's okay.
But there was a couple of other things we met. Well, I guess sexual abuse now is one thing that's talked a lot about is consent. Hi, my video's on. Is consent. So obviously there was no consent with them stripping him. And also we saw like they went behind the temple and kind of behind closed doors played this game with him, if you like, stripping him and putting the cloak on him. And sexual abuse is nearly always behind closed doors, and it's not out in the open. So there's a couple of other things that we kind of noticed. And also just thinking now, we didn't talk about this in our group, but taking someone's clothes off, you will be physically touching them on their body as well. So yeah.
Okay.
I can't raise my hand either, but
Go ahead.
my singular face can raise my hand.
Go for
I'm
it.
Lorraine, and I'm from the tiny room of 2, because there were 2 of us. It was actually room 11. It took us a while to kind of discuss.
Sorry, did we lose you, Lorraine?
Lorraine, have we lost you?
I'm always lost. We're all lost.
Welcome back.
We were kind of talking about the differentiation between abuse and sexual abuse, and that having reread some of Joe Int's book about God, Sex and Us recently, it made me wonder, like, where do we say it's sexual abuse and where is it abuse of sexuality? So as a sexual being, all of us have a sexuality, and therefore the exposure of that without consent is huge, and therefore that's abusive. And then something else that Ab said, something about the genitality of sexual abuse that differentiates it from any other kind of abuse. And we've been talking in, like some people have mentioned, about the abuse of power, but it feels like it's probably more than that, because it isn't just the abuse of power, because it's not just making him the victim of humiliation, it's more than that. And the absolute powerlessness of being able to express who you are or cover yourself up, as one of those images quite powerfully showed, I think that kind of changes it a bit. And we were discussing, like, one of us was saying, oh yeah, it's sexual abuse, and the other one was, I don't know, jury's out. So I'm still uncertain, and having worked with a lot of victims of sexual abuse, I don't know if they would read it and say, I see myself here. I think they'd see elements, but I don't know if they would say what I have been through is the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. Any other burning?
Yeah, Robin.
Robin and Belinda as well raised a hand. Maybe Robin first.
You can't see me, but I can see you. It was just on the element of Jesus being left all night with those soldiers, and that they knew he was the king of the Jews, so they had a lot to mock him about, and he was at their mercy. And that's a group of about 480 soldiers who are hardened from wars, so tough people. And it just sort of, I've always been frightened for Jesus in that situation, being left with a group of men who could wind themselves up and do what they liked with someone they knew who was going to be crucified. So I've always personally assumed there was sexual abuse in there.
Okay. Mark, who was the other one?
Belinda.
Hi, Belinda. Thank you, Jayme. I think that's very significant. I think too that the process of grooming of the soldiers, who may well have come from village backgrounds or countries elsewhere, and who themselves may not necessarily have understood or expected to be exposed to those sorts of behaviours, is something that means that they too have become abused and desensitized. And I don't know that we necessarily think of that very often.
Yeah, agree with that. Charles, you've had your hand up. I've seen that for a while. So, Charles.
Thank you. It's just that we linked up the physical abuse with the sexual abuse, which often goes together. So sexual abuse is often accompanied by violence, which is what it happened here, where they were hitting him. But also, I think we felt that very much the power issue and the lack of consent meant that it was abuse, and that if we were thinking of Jesus as a woman, it would be more easy for us to say, yes, this is sexual abuse and physical abuse. As somebody said earlier, there's touch going on. People are stripping the clothes, they're touching the body, we don't know where their hands are going. And I have, you know, having worked in mental health for years, I feel very clear that this is physical and sexual abuse. And the interesting thing is that because Jesus, as far as we know, is male, it helps us to realize that men can be abused as well as women. So that was, I was in group 9, by the way. I was in group 9.
Okay.
That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay.
I can't raise my hand at all, but can I say something?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
We weren't sure what undergarments Jesus was wearing and the extent to which he was stripped. Because you hear, first of all, that they clothed him in a purple cloak, which could just be an extra outer garment, or they take his cloak off and put the purple one on to mock him. And then they give him back his clothes, which is hematia, which could just be his tunic and his cloak. So our question was a bit, what was he wearing underneath? Because it's easy to imagine he was naked, but that may well not be the case. But he might have had a loincloth or something like that on maybe. In which case it puts a slightly different hue on it from if we're imagining him as naked. And likewise, when he was crucified, do we know that people were definitely crucified completely naked? Or again, might they have had a loincloth or something on?
It's a good question. Do we want to answer that now, David, or do you want to do that after the break? What do you think?
Should we make a few comments now, and then after the break we can focus more on the meaning and why does it matter? It's been absolutely fascinating to hear the discussion. Thanks to everyone for sharing so clearly and helpfully the different things you've been talking about. In terms of that very last question, just an observation on the text we see in front of us in Mark. It's absolutely right that what we read is they clothed him in a purple cloak, and therefore it's not immediately obvious that that's the first stripping. It's only, as you said, when we come down later to putting his own clothes on him, we become aware that there has been a stripping with the purple cloak. It's worth noting in Matthew makes this much more explicit. He makes, and he probably knows the Mark passage, so he goes out of his way to make clear that that is initially, that the clothing is actually a stripping. Whether or not it's a full stripping, full nudity, is harder to tell at this stage. I think when we get down to the crucifixion scene, at least in John's Gospel, we're told that the undergarment or the tunic is taken as well. So at least for that, we have clarity. We don't know about an undergarment in the other strippings, though I think the 2 points might be made. First of all, just as we don't know for sure there isn't an undergarment, we certainly don't know that there is, and there's no mention of an undergarment or a loincloth in those first two strippings. I think the other point that can be made on that is if you read this as intentional humiliation, which I think everybody has, it seems to make sense that that intentional humiliation would be most effective if it's full nakedness rather than partial nakedness. But it's not absolutely explicit in the text. We, as far as I know, there's no evidence of victims of crucifixion having loincloths. It's also perhaps true to say we don't have absolutely explicit evidence that all victims of crucifixion were fully naked. But I think the general tenor of understanding that crucifixion was so scandalous, so humiliating, so demeaning, the impression given is full nakedness, and that fits with what the Romans are doing. And then the other small point about the text, and somebody's already said it, absolutely exactly right, is the whole cohort is, the whole cohort is a large number of soldiers. Notionally, a cohort was 600 soldiers. In practice, numbers were often down on that, and the figure of 480 might well be correct, or sort of ballpark 500. But the number of soldiers is not the 2 or 3 figures that we see in many of the depictions of the stripping. So there's a mismatch between the way the stripping is depicted, which is almost invariably the stripping at the cross, where there's just a few people involved, and what the text actually tells us, which is the whole cohort. So not only is a cohort nearly 500 soldiers typically, but the text goes out of its way to emphasize that it was the whole cohort. So it is a very significant number here.
Mark has suggested, just given the interest of time, that we just go ahead with questions and do. So we'll talk a little bit about the kind of, well, why we think this matters, and then we can take more questions if that's okay with everybody. So let me see. Let me move this to, yeah. So why does it matter? So the questions that we ask in relation to this is, did the torture and crucifixion of Jesus involve some form of sexual abuse, which is what we've been talking about in response to the questions for the Bible study. But then the knock-on questions for that is, what difference should this make for the church today? How, even reading that text, what did you notice this time that you've not noticed previously? And then how will that inform how you read that text in the future? But then also, what difference does this make for us? And then what consequences does this have for our theological understanding of God's gracious and healing presence in the world? So David, were there specific things that you want to talk about in relation to the why it matters and why we work on, making connections for folks?
Sure, thanks, Jayme. So since first doing this work, which at least originally started as working with the text and how the text is interpreted and some of the historical elements, it's opened up these more pastoral and theological issues. And we've been pressed to give an answer to, well, what difference does this make? Why is this important, and particularly why is it important for the church? A lot of people said, well, they find the historical side of it convincing, but they're not sure why it should be given attention. And in fact, could it not just be something that's taking us in the wrong direction? So for me, it's important to think carefully about, well, why should the church be concerned with this? What is it that makes this good news rather than just disturbing and painful news? We can all see the traumatic elements of this, the disturbing elements of this, but where can we see God's presence in this? Where can we see what might be good news in this? So some of the work that we've been doing, and one of the discussion groups asked about this, is how would survivors read this? Has work been done taking this passage to survivors and working with them? And that's the work that you mentioned Rocio is doing with Survivors Group. We've now completed 2 studies, one with male survivors and one with female survivors, both in terms of church-related sexual abuse. And one of the really interesting things which has come out of that research is that survivors are split on how useful this is for them. Some find it very useful, and we can talk more about that. Others are less convinced that this is useful for them personally. But they are all convinced that this is really important for the church. So every survivor we've spoken to in both studies has said, you know, whatever survivors might make of this for their own benefit, it's the church that needs to be grappling with this. And I think what's behind that is a sense that the church does not handle this well. that many in the church have failed to address the stripping of Jesus as a form of sexual abuse. And what's behind that is partly it's just not noticed, but when it is noticed, it's seen as something that's stigmatizing, something that the church needs to keep as a distance. And that communicates a negative message that the church holds in relation to survivors. So that for me is one of the more significant reasons that it matters, because it opens up a new conversation about if we take it that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, and recognizing some people might have reservations on that, but if he was, where does that leave the church in terms of how it relates to victims of sexual abuse, how it relates to Jesus? That's a conversation that then becomes unavoidable.
Also, it's also related to the question around acknowledgement. Is if the church never as a survivor of abuse myself in a church setting, the situation would be that the church never spoke about that. They never talked about it. It was never addressed in any kind of situation. And so this issue of acknowledgement of those who have suffered from it, it can seem as if the church doesn't want to know, and that the experiences of survivors is unimportant. So even regardless of whether or not we say that someone or that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, the inability for the church to even consider that as a possibility, acknowledge it, or is an acknowledgement basically that the church isn't able to acknowledge that it exists. And so this issue that it's the loincloth or however we present Jesus without thinking about this possibility is this disguising with a veneer of decency that I think we need to be really careful about as it serves to silence folks. And so if the experiences of survivors is never addressed in the church, then it's really easy to be taken that this message that there's just something wrong with them, which is what David was saying, that continuation of stigmatization. Also, we've got this situation where we say Jesus is a blameless victim, but yet the way in which we treat victims of sexual violence is as if they've done something wrong. Even if we know full well they didn't, we still think there's something they did. And so considering the possibility, if Jesus is the blameless victim, then there's also a situation whereby we have victims within our own congregations who might also be blameless too. And so in the context of the Me Too situation, that is one of the takeaways that we've been working on specifically.
Jayme, if I could jump in on that,
of course,
if you've got the screen, if you could forward it on a bit. We actually have a quote from a survivor, which I think makes that point. Keep going. One more, I think. So this for me was one of the more powerful statements by one of the female survivors that Rocio spoke to in our most recent discussion paper. And we actually took an extract from this quote for the name of that working paper: "Seeing his innocence, I see my innocence." So it's on your screen. Forgive me for reading it, but I think we'll have something a little bit extra by being read. So this is what Maria said to us. Despite, excuse me, despite saying to myself, "You are not guilty," one part of me, in my innermost part, maintains my guilt and leads me to accuse myself. You could have done something to avoid the abuse. And then I have the experience and the knowledge that Jesus was innocent. That makes it easier to believe that I am innocent. It has been a beginning. Reading it has been like a relief. It is not just on a theoretical level. There is an emotional level that helps me to go into my heart. I love Jesus. I don't blame him. I don't say to him, "You had to do something. You could have avoided it." Seeing his innocence, I see my innocence. And one of the things which I think is significant about this quote is Maria does believe that she is innocent. She doesn't need this to recognize that fact at one level. And yet, even though she knows herself that she's innocent, she still struggles with affirming that. She still finds it useful to look to the innocence of Jesus, to find strength and resilience, to reassert her own innocence when others suggest that she is somehow to blame, or she herself in some way feels that there's something to blame. And for me, one of the reasons that this is powerful for the church is because people, after a presentation like this, often say, actually, I recognize in myself something going on that was quite complex. Because when I first heard the idea that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, I had a negative reaction. And it was a negative reaction that I'm now thinking about in terms of my own instinctive responses. And I can now see that there was something problematic in that. Leaving aside the actual evidence or not, the negative reaction that if Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, then there's something wrong with him, or he's less worthy of respect, or less worthy of worship, or just worth less in some general sense, or just worthless in some general sense. All of these are actually complex emotions which are probably far more current than most people would like to acknowledge and be honest about. But I think this Bible study gives opportunities for that to be discussed and processed and reflected on in a constructive way. Because I think there are negative responses to this work which behind them have negative assumptions about victims and survivors. And that, for me, is why this doesn't just matter, but it matters especially to the church.